On the morning of June 1, 1921, one of the wealthiest black communities in the United States no longer existed. It had been destroyed in under 18 hours by a mob, by the Tulsa Police Department, and by aircraft that circled overhead while the killing was done. Nobody was ever charged. Greenwood, Oklahoma was not a slum or a ghetto. It was a self-contained economic ecosystem built deliberately because Black Americans had been excluded from white commerce and responded by building their own. By 1921, the 35-square-block district held more than 600 Black-owned businesses, 21 churches, 2 newspapers, a library, a hospital, a law school, and a bus system. Booker T. Washington had toured it in 1905 and described it in terms that would eventually give rise to the name Black Wall Street, not as flattery, but as a factual description of what accumulation and exclusion had produced together. The man who would survive the next 48 hours and spend the rest of his life trying to make people understand what he had witnessed was a 17-year-old named Robert Fairchild. He was one of thousands of residents, doctors, teachers, attorneys, mechanics, who woke on the morning of May 31st with no reason to believe the day would end any differently than the one before it. Greenwood had problems, as every community does, but it had infrastructure. It had capital. It had, by the standards of 1921 America, something approaching security. What it did not have was a white city willing to let it stand. The incident that ignited the massacre was the arrest of Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old shoe shiner, on May 30th. He had entered an elevator in downtown Tulsa and allegedly stumbled into or grabbed the arm of a white elevator operator named Sarah Page. The charges were never proven. Page herself later declined to press them. But the Tulsa Tribune ran a headline that afternoon calling for a lynching, and by evening, a crowd of several hundred white men had gathered outside the courthouse jail, armed, demanding Rowland be handed over. A group of Black veterans from Greenwood arrived to protect him, also armed, and entirely within their rights under Oklahoma law. Words were exchanged, a gun was fired, and with that, the courthouse standoff became the pretext for something that had been incubating much longer than a single evening. Here's the part that requires the most careful reading. What followed was not a riot. The word riot implies mutual violence between equivalent parties. What happened in Greenwood was a coordinated, one-directional attack on a civilian population, conducted by private citizens working alongside Tulsa law enforcement, with apparent support from city and county officials. Tulsa police deputized white members of the mob on the spot, handing them badges and authority and sending them directly into Greenwood. The Tulsa Police Department did not attempt to protect Greenwood's residents. It arrested them. By the early hours of June 1st, thousands of white attackers had entered Greenwood on foot and by vehicle. Some estimates place the number as high as 10,000. They were armed with rifles, shotguns, and in some cases machine guns, weapons that, by multiple accounts, included arms from National Guard supplies, though the precise chain of acquisition remains disputed. They burned buildings methodically and block by block, while residents fled on foot or were shot in their yards. The Frisco Railroad tracks marked the boundary of Greenwood, and when residents tried to cross them to escape, some were killed in the attempt. Others were marched at gunpoint to internment facilities set up at Convention Hall and the fairgrounds, where more than 6,000 Black Tulsans were detained, many held for days. What the investigation commissioned by Oklahoma in 2001 confirmed, and what many residents had insisted for 80 years, was that aircraft circled over Greenwood during the attack. Whether they dropped incendiary materials or were used for surveillance and targeting is still technically disputed, but witness accounts from multiple independent survivors describe planes firing into the crowd and into buildings. The state commission declined to rule this out. In the context of everything else the Tulsa authorities were willing to do that night, the idea that aerial attack was uniquely beyond them is difficult to defend. 1,256 homes were destroyed. 35 city blocks reduced to rubble. Somewhere between 100 and 300 people killed. The range exists because no serious count was ever conducted. Mass graves were reported and then denied. The Red Cross documented 10,000 Tulsans left homeless. The total property loss was estimated at roughly $1.5 to $2 million in 1921 dollars, a figure that, adjusted for inflation using standard consumer price measures, represents well over $25 million today, and by some broader economic value calculations, considerably more. Robert Fairchild survived. He watched his neighborhood burn and spent the following decades living with the knowledge that no one was ever prosecuted, not a single person, for a single crime on either day. The grand jury impaneled shortly after the massacre concluded that blame lay primarily with Greenwood's black residents for having shown up armed at the courthouse. This verdict required the jury to ignore the deputized mob, the arrested civilians, the burned hospital, the demolished church pews still visible in the rubble, and produce a finding of collective self-infliction. But here is what the aftermath reveals more plainly than any of the violence itself. Immediately after the massacre, white Tulsa business interests attempted to rezone Greenwood so it could never be rebuilt as a black neighborhood. The plan failed only because Greenwood's residents, dispossessed and traumatized, rebuilt anyway, with such speed and determination that the effort to replace them with white commerce couldn't keep pace. They raised new structures on the ruins. The second Greenwood lasted until urban renewal projects demolished much of it in the 1960s. The destruction of Black Wall Street was not a moment of collective madness. It was a policy, carried out with law enforcement support, city authority, and near-total legal impunity, to eliminate a community that had committed the offense of succeeding on its own terms. The cover-up began before the smoke had cleared, and it held for 50 years. What it could not do was make the fact of what happened disappear. The records survived. The survivors gave testimony. The rubble gave way to the buildings they raised on top of it. And we know, with the specificity that a crime demands, exactly what was done, and by whom. If this episode made you think differently, subscribe. New episodes every week. And if you want to go deeper, there's more waiting for you.